Mm. Mm-hmm. Kate, exactly. Behaviors tend to really shift, right, with the introduction of a quality intervention. We have just a couple more minutes, so if anyone else has ideas you want to write them, and otherwise I will invite you to orally share anything that you would like to when we get started. Hi, Nina. Hi, Lori. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly, Jeanette. Oh, well. Mm-hmm. That was the purpose of the writing activity, by the way, was to kind of get us to into the mindset of what it's like to be a kid who struggles, right? Um, right. I'm reading what Mindy wrote too, like the intervention that doesn't match the student can actually backfire. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Right, Nina. That patience for the students, imagine what it's like, right? To be struggling all day, every day in school. That exercise is powerful for that. And I've returned to it actually many times over the years as a nice reminder for myself. Because even once you've done it, it still can be easy to forget and to kind of not let yourself fall back into assuming they should be able to do this by now kind of thinking, and to really force yourself to look at the classroom and learning experiences from the lens of the students. There's no substitute for that in my experience. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Lori. So that idea about the difficulty of concentration and attention and misinterpretation potentially of what a student is responding to or having difficulty with is is kind of what I love about working on this construct, right? Because it doesn't look like the most obvious one that's embedded in these really powerful ways at school, but yet it's so pervasive, it's invisible at some level. Um, right, right. So, and then I'm looking at what Nina's saying, right, I'm saying, and them not being able to form letters correctly, even when writing slowly, it's really important to build those graphomotor skills before a student is expected to be able to keep up with the pace of note taking with everybody else. Um, Good. These are good insights, people. I appreciate you being willing to share what's coming up for you. We're going to get started in the kind of more formal section. If you're writing right now, like a idea, continue, please. If you haven't yet begun one, or you feel free to not write any more responses to the question I posted, because we'll move into this kind of other part of our time together. But that's what I was hoping. So I read the discussion forum for last week and for whoever had already posted for this week, just to check in on how that activity impacted your thinking, and the kinds of ideas that were coming up for people. And I was impressed with the level of insight that you all were sharing, especially around this idea of the crossover among constructs and the potential for misinterpretation due to the extreme frustration that occurs with a graphomotor weakness, in particular in the classroom. But it looked like from the other assignments I read that people were posting, like the week 1 and week 2 assignments of the neuromotor demands, that although the activity for writing with a non-dominant hand really gave a window into what it's like to be at school for a kid who struggles with graphomotor weakness, you are starting to think about the oromotor, gross motor, and fine motor demands that are also embedded in typical classroom tasks and activities. And so there really isn't a lot of respite for kids that are struggling with these motor functions in the classroom. There's not a lot of freedom to think and learn without also implicating your motor movement. In some ways, that's similar to the language construct because it's so pervasive that it's also largely invisible. But the language at least gets some attention in terms of reading and writing development, like direct attention over the course of a student's life in schooling. Whereas neuromotor function receives some attention in early grades when kids are first learning to write and have handwriting, and also with those fine motor tasks of cutting, coloring, and pasting and all that kind of stuff. But much past middle elementary and upper elementary, it really disappears. Direct attention to supporting and improving students' neuromotor, like motor output. However, the demands don't disappear. A writing task to a person struggling with graphomotor function actually becomes more unwieldy as the grades get higher, largely because the expectations for output are increased dramatically over time. Keyboarding, of course, then is a nice way to bypass, but also for kids that are struggling with fine motor function around keyboarding, that's potentially not particularly helpful. And so to the extent to which schooling stops offering explicit attention to neuromotor function, except for in PE class potentially, and doesn't address the realities of what students are being asked to do, it can be a source of silent frustration throughout the entire day. Yes, Linnell. Linnell wrote, it made me realize even more so that avoidance of work can also be due to difficulty with the motor function in writing. Yes. So that lesson, which I think I kind of touched on, we touched on a bit last week and also in course 2, but that lesson that like a avoidant behavior or a disruptive behavior, or in these early grades, I know a lot of us are teaching primary grades, a tantrum behavior is a communication on the part of the child. Adopting that lens really opens up this world of like, well, what is the challenge, right? It's not just that that person isn't motivated, or it isn't just that that young child, is someone who just isn't into school. Typically, that's actually highly unusual. What is much more common is that that student is facing daily barrages of obstacles to learning and becomes turned off to the idea of learning in the first place or participating in schooling because it's so frustrating and humiliating. Mindy's saying it's hard when students don't get any formal training in keyboarding, so are inefficient or slow typers. I have had that on my mind for some length of time. And I think I mentioned it with John last week, like my son, I'm starting to give him some keyboarding exposure in kindergarten. But kids tend to, there's a whole, internal, first of all, there's a huge time crunch, right? But then there's also like a print handwriting practice, cursive handwriting practice, and keyboarding are all kind of competing skills to work on in a very short amount of time in these middle elementary grades and or upper elementary, especially for keyboarding. I don't have a good resolve. I know there's a lot of people at Fenton and or people who are at other schools. Does anyone here have keyboarding instruction that's formalized at your site? Because I have very rarely seen that. I've seen sometimes high schools will offer like typing classes, but as an elective, or at least they did when I was in high school, which is a really long time ago at this point. But I'm wondering if there are schools that are really addressing that. Um, I just don't know. You had it in as an elective in high school too, Linnell? Hi. Yeah. Oh. Oh, Chime, you have it. Oh, that's so great. Linnell, what grades does it start in? Sixth. Okay. So that, yay, of course, of all places, I'm not shocked. Chime would offer that, right? Like that is something that kids really need. In your technology special, Mindy's saying students play games to work on their typing speed. Exactly. Yeah. No, it's typically not enforced all the time when they're using computers, like that your hands are on the appropriate place, which is also not that dissimilar, right? Like once kids get beyond direct handwriting instruction, their letter formation is typically not something that is that closely monitored either. And frankly, it's difficult, right? As a classroom teacher in upper elementary grades and beyond, it's very difficult to watch everybody's letter formation and make sure that they're using the appropriate approach to that. Is cursive still practiced in upper grades? That's a great, so the cursive debate is a huge one. And do I have that article linked on our Moodle page? I think I do, but I will look it up. This came up the last time we did this course last year, is this cursive question. So what I can tell you is what I know of recent research is that cursive is actually, cursive was kind of on its way out in the last many years, and then with the crunch to do more reading and math, right, their like handwriting practice really took a back seat, and cursive in particular. So there's a kind of mid-generation of people that like didn't practice a lot of cursive and don't write well in cursive, which is problematic in certain ways, but was still happening, especially with the introduction of keyboarding skills being as important as they are. However, there's been research in the last couple of years that actually forming cursive letters is easier and desirable for some subset of children. It's preferable to learning people that are really struggling with graphomotor function. Cursive can, because the letters are connected and the way the motions go, it's actually a better approach to handwriting practice. So it's still in debate and in flux, and it's not a settled issue by any stretch of the imagination. Fenton, Bridget, you're saying, Fenton, you have no keyboarding. But you do have a program that touches upon correct. Yeah. And I find, like, with my own son, that's actually just locating where the letters are on the keyboard is kind of where he's at right now. So I started out trying to have him use the appropriate like a hand position on the keyboard, but then I realized that he doesn't know where the letters are, like which row they are, and so I've actually been letting him hunt and peck with the games that we do, just so that he can get a kind of landscape of like what the keyboard shows. My dad struggled. I'm reading Mindy's post until someone taught him to write with all 90-degree angles, basically very boxy, so no curves. Right. So that's a nice example of why this issue is so complex, right? So there's recent research that for certain kids, the connectedness of the letters is hugely beneficial and makes an enormous impact. For Mindy's dad, that would likely have been really difficult if what worked for him was the 90-degree angles. For some people, keyboarding is highly desirable and expected. For others, not so much. And the field is not settled on this, which, as whoever's a classroom teacher, I'm sure has encountered this kind of confusion. The kids don't know, and in my, like, from where I sit, to be honest, I don't know that the field will come up with a singular best way. It may be that there is a match between your motor skills and abilities and the kind of optimal mode of communicating through writing, and that, at least from where I sit and the kinds of classrooms that I have run, making space for multiple modes is preferable to having everybody attempt to use the same mode because it's been determined as best. So I think that idea of really like what's embedded into this neurodevelopmental framework of really understanding what's going on with individual kids at this level, the constructs are a delightful, lovely lens to understand the nature of particular students' struggles and their strengths and their interests. From where I sit, one of the most powerful aspects of that is that then it opens up the potential to match the tasks to that. So for students that are struggling with graphomotor function, it may be that a keyboard is preferable, it may be that cursive is preferable, it may be that 90-degree angle box writing is preferable, and that is likely inconsistent across individuals. So it can be, of course, organizationally not totally straightforward to make space for that, but I find actually in practice it's a lot easier than asking kids to engage in the experience of what the non-dominant hand note-taking activity called up. So the extreme difficulty of attempting a motor function through a mode that is not suited to your strengths, the extreme difficulty that that calls up is likely larger than the amount of kind of preparation and planning for making space for multiple modes of motor participation. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense to people, and I don't know if other people have other thoughts on that. I'm open because this is tangential but important. It's not specifically about the way the components of neuromotor function are laid out in the construct and in the neurodevelopmental framework, but it's incredibly relevant to day-to-day working with kids. So I'm just curious about other people's perspectives on this. How difficult is it to offer these alternatives, or would it be? And would there be, so my question to you is really this, like in your own work with kids, how does making space for these kind of multiple modes of motor output, how difficult is that in the context of your work? Are there requirements that you then bump up against in your classroom? Are there just kind of norms and routines that are difficult, or does it seem like preferable and easy, or straightforward at least? Now I'm going to read Mindy's question. Mindy's saying, for students for whom keyboarding is best, what about the very quick, in-the-moment writing? Right. So what Mindy's question is actually quite similar to what I was asking all of you. I wonder if anybody has an answer to that. So what Mindy says is like, look, okay, so what if it is better for a particular kid to use a keyboard, but then using a keyboard doesn't actually align with all of the tasks that kids are asked to do over the course of a day? So quick taking notes, maybe writing on a graphic organizer with a partner. There might be all kinds of adding your ideas onto a chart. There might be moments when actually a keyboard is going to make things appear more difficult. How can we accommodate that, or what should we do about that? Math too, exactly. Showing things, yeah. Does anyone have an idea from experience, or an idea just from your own thinking? And if you want to chime in orally, you can unmute yourself, or else tell me if I need to unmute you, which I'm happy to do. Otherwise, feel free to chat it. I have my own thoughts, which I will share after, if you would like. Let's just see, what can we do about that? So I'll answer while people are writing, if they are or not, from my own experience at Chime, actually. I taught 4th grade. Oh, that's okay, Kate, don't worry about it. The question is what to do about providing an accommodation for kids who, like, maybe keyboarding is better, but then that doesn't always match up with everything they're asked to do during the day. Like, keyboarding might be the best mode for a kid to actually communicate their thoughts, but how does that kid then participate in filling in a graphic organizer with a partner during an activity? That's all. So I will tell you from my own experience how I have managed and handled that at Chime, and then for anyone else who has ideas, please share them, because I'm not pretending mine is like the only way. But I mean, it was a mixture of things. One is sometimes I would use those times when kids did need to write by hand instead of keyboarding as opportunities for them to practice in that kind of intervention, accommodation, distinction we made last week when we were talking. I might use those short moments when kids do need to actually form letters as an opportunity to practice letter formation when typically they're bypassing the weakness through keyboarding. This provides an opportunity to not bypass that weakness. Sometimes I would do, at time I would modify lessons ahead of time, right? So knowing who I had in the class. So sometimes for those kids, I would just give them options of pre-printed, depending on the task. Sometimes they would get like options of pre-printed terms that they would glue down, or some way to maintain the bypassing of the graphomotor weakness without compromising engagement in the learning goal. That would be a big one. Sometimes I would have kids partnered or in group work, and that kid would just like not be the scribe. They might be the presenter for their group and assign someone else the scribe role if that's a weakness, so that they could still engage in the cognitive work of the lesson. Those are just ideas. Writing on the whiteboard to show your answer. Yeah. So like that whiteboard at math time thing, that's a hard one, and that came up a lot for me in the classroom with kids that did have a lot of difficulty with that. And typically I would have those kids make choices, or I would provide a whiteboard where most of the problem was written out and they had to write their thinking on the side. Or for some kids that actually did not have graphomotor function at all, sometimes there would be another adult in the room or paraprofessional that could help them with that, or a partnered child. That's a good point. Maybe there's a whiteboard type app on an iPad, and they could at least use a finger to draw. There are those. I know there are because my son's kindergarten teacher was showing me there is an app for drawing. I haven't thought of using that as an iPad replacement for a whiteboard, but I love that idea actually. Has anyone tried something like that? Or used technology in that way? I really like that. Yeah, so great suggestion, by the way. And now I'm thinking of like how I want to use it in my own work with my son. But here's what I noticed when the teacher showed me the use of the iPad, that she was replacing, I don't think she does it all the time, but she did it at least one day with my son where he has difficulty with handwriting practice and the writing task, and so it's so much easier for him just to use his finger on the iPad than it is to hold the pencil and form the letters appropriately, that I think it was during a writing task she let him use that app instead of writing on paper. Notes on the iPad can be used that way. Oh, great. Great, so that's so easy. Maybe that's what she was using. I don't know that it was anything more complex. It literally just looked like you use your finger to draw, right? Great. Okay. What I would say is just be kind of... Mindy's saying just be cognizant of the profiles, right? So the demand is not the barrier. So flexible timing, short responses. Great. You know what, Linnell? Maybe that's what she was showing me, because it was whatever it was, his teacher said you could record it, and that was the idea. Yeah, and that she said, oh, it approximates what it's like to write on a paper, because then I have it, I can save his work. I don't think it's consistently implemented. I was in there yesterday, and it was not. He had a typical writing task. But if anyone else tries it, let us know, okay? Great. So these ideas are important and useful, and I know that several people have looked already at some of the resources that are posted on our Moodle page. I encourage you to download any of those and all of those that are of interest and use. I put a bunch of things up there after our talk last week. I put up some sensory stuff, I put up some OT stuff, and then we had already had, because this course kind of covers the idea of handwriting and supports for handwriting and alternatives for graphomotor output, because it's such a pervasive and important issue for kids in the classroom. So the other thing I want to ask is, have people seen this video that I find really powerful and I've returned to a ton, and it's going to kind of lead us into the social cognition, which we're starting next week, and it's the Fat City Rick Lavoie video. Has anyone seen that? I'm going to write the title of it down here. Okay, so at least one person. Yeah. So this video, if you haven't seen it, you don't have to. It's not an assignment for the course, but it is extremely powerful. And if you would like to send that packet you have, Mindy, that would be great. You could either post it or send it to me, and I'll post it. That would be awesome. Basically, FAT stands for frustration, anger, and tension. And it's an older video. Rick Lavoie is still around, but this video was made in the 80s, so it's still as powerful as it was when it came out, but there's a few, like the terminology isn't updated, so he'll talk a lot about like LD kids, learning disabled kids, whereas now we would typically use kid first language, things like that. However, he does this simulation of what it's like to have a language processing difficulty that will likely remind you of the handwriting, the note-taking with non-dominant hand activity we did for last week. And it gives another window into how school occurs for kids that are struggling with language processing. Obviously, we're not working on the language construct now, but this idea of a weakness in one construct showing up across multiple constructs and really dominating a student's school experience is very well demonstrated in this Fat City simulation. So I pulled it off YouTube recently. The entire hour-long video is on YouTube. The first 10 minutes is what I have recently shared in my own classes I'm teaching. And it's a very powerful 10 minutes. So if you have some time and you're like, I wonder what it's like from the kids' side, not just about note-taking or writing, but about any time they're listening to something a teacher's saying or attempting to listen, and they have a language difficulty, it's a really great reminder. And it also provides, at least for me, a good reference point for knowing that I need to slow down what I'm asking of kids, when I'm talking to them, to make sure I have multiple representations with anything I say is always accompanied by some kind of visual. It has that kind of feel to it. No props. Okay, good. Yay, Mindy, that would be great if you don't mind bringing that in. So, my question to you guys, well, there's a couple things I want to tell you. But we'll talk about it in a couple minutes. I was just checking my clock. There was something, I think it was Bridget had brought up in her one of the discussion forums about differentiated assessments. And I wanted to raise that idea now because assessments are, with the Fat City video, right? Like they're typically very language oriented. So for a kid that's struggling with language, the assessment is often typically assessing language primarily, or at least as a gateway to assessing conceptual knowledge or skills-based knowledge. But graphomotor function and fine motor function, especially in primary grades, is quite similar to that, in that if you have a graphomotor weakness or a fine motor weakness in primary grades primarily, but also in upper grades sometimes, that can be a barrier to showing what you know at all, as we all saw with the note-taking activity. And so I guess what I wanted to kind of ask you all is about some thoughts on ways to differentiate assessments so that you can find out what kids know without having them be shut out of the learning process due to a motor weakness. So I'm going to write that down. Like, in what ways could we differentiate assessments so that students can show what they know without the demands on graphomotor function? Thoughts? Okay, so one is to dictate it. That's right. I agree. And I'm going to challenge you guys. Yes, that would work, by the way, Kate. That does work. I'm going to challenge you all, though. Okay, ready? I want to see if we can think of ways to differentiate assessments that don't involve teacher support directly. Reason being, typically, there is only one teacher in the classroom and a lot of kids. So I always like to think of ways to design supports that in a perfect world, the kid could then participate without an adult's help. Does that make sense? See if we can think of some. I just want to generate some ideas. I can give you some for myself too. Hi. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, who's
Hi.
this?
Oh, okay, sorry. Well, like, when you bring that up, like, I find it interesting because you mentioned earlier, like, projects,
Yes.
and today, like, at my work, we had, like, a very lengthy in-service on project-based learning,
Oh,
and I
great.
think if you, and it basically, like, you give them, like, a sheet, like, a question, and then basically all the information, the kids have to, like, figure it all out,
Mm-hmm.
and I think when you do something like that and the kids are given to assign the group and you give them roles, then, knowing the student has mental motor issues,
Mm-hmm.
they can contribute their, basically, like, all their ideas without having to fight as much for that.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Who is this, by the way? I'm so sorry. I didn't see who jumped in. Thank you. Perfect. That's a great example. So, like roles, alternative roles for a group, you can assess the content, but then that kid isn't necessarily the person in most demand. Thank you. Perfect example. I keep calling you Alex. I'm sorry, Alexandra. Spelling tests allow the student to spell out the words with magnetic letters. Love it. So, magnetic letters for spelling tests. Yeah, why not, right? What else could we do? Oh, dictate. I'm going to write to, this is Kate's idea, to a teacher, and I'm going to write if it's okay, or a peer. And I'm doing that for that reason of avoiding more burdens on what a teacher kind of needs to do in live time. I saw this really interesting video on Teaching Channel about a month ago, and it was a first grade lesson. I encourage you to go there if you haven't. And it was a lesson where there was academic choice. It was a differentiated lesson, and it was also having the first graders kind of select the mode of expressing what they know for assessment. They were choosing it based on the way they like to show what they know, and so the learning goal was retelling, beginning, middle, and end, characters and setting, and they were using Goldilocks and Three Bears as their model text, and they read a bunch of versions, and then the kids needed to engage in retelling, and then the teacher was assessing, like, do they have beginning, middle, end, characters, and setting, right? And so she gave them these options of writing what they know, so that's a typical assessment, acting out the skit the story in a skit format, orally recounting the story, or showing it through Play-Doh art, which I found really fascinating. And there was this whole section where the kids were really excited about this, and the ones that had chosen Play-Doh art had large pieces of paper, and they used the Play-Doh almost as paint. They were kind of pushing it down to show the story, and then they had to show all the elements, the characters, the setting. They had to have accurate items in the setting, and then I think she came over and asked them about what was happening to determine the beginning, middle, and end. But I thought it was a really nice way to afford and enable all kids in the class, regardless of motor function, ability, and skill, to participate in the learning goal and to really actively take it on and to select for themselves the mode that they wanted to use to express their knowledge. And I just thought that was really powerful. I'm going to write art choices. You guys were writing to each other. Dragon dictation. Good, Kate. I was about to ask the same question. Oh, it types what the students say. Has that technology developed to the point where it doesn't look like totally different from what students say? I know that like speech to text technology a couple years ago had not caught up with the accents and ways that people actually speak. There's a lot of disability tech related to that. Oh, yeah, you might, Kate saying other students. So that's, Kate, potentially something that becomes a challenge, right? When you start to open up differentiation for assessments, that's something you need to accommodate. What could Kate do if other kids would hear the answer? Oh, letter cards, I liked that. Okay, good. You guys are coming up with really useful ideas for each other. So I have this here partly marked because then you can return to it, hopefully at some point. Hi. So, trying to see what I want to work on with you guys next. Okay. All right, good. So let's move. We have two other things I want to kind of talk to you about tonight. One is will take us into social cognition, which we're starting next week. But before that, well, social. I'm going to show you something first, because then we'll talk a little bit about social cognition and then your lesson, your assignment for the time. So, is anyone here familiar with Robert Brooks? There's Rick Lavoie, who is this Fat City person, and then there's another really great PD leader / writer that does a lot of work around mindsets, and his name is Dr. Robert Brooks. Okay, so Dr. Robert Brooks, I encourage you to go to this website if you are enjoying what I'm about to talk to you about. It's his website. He has a lot of really interesting blog posts and resources and all that kind of stuff. He talks about this notion of resilience and mindsets a lot. And as I was reading people's posts, especially about the note-taking activity, it was really calling up for me his work, because I was seeing the kinds of comments you all were making really started to address the sense of dread for school-based tasks, if that's what it's going to be like for you. The idea of starting to get a little bit of insight into kids who are resistant to participating in tasks, who end up looking kind of checked out, unmotivated, they'll often be referred to as, or exhibit these really negative behaviors or features of what would be a negative mindset. And so for kids that struggle with motor function, really across all of the constructs in different ways, but we're thinking about it in terms of motor function right now, having some amount of resilience in the face of frustration is really crucial, right? So, we did that activity using the non-dominant hand, so had like 5 minutes. That activity was not even 5 minutes long. It was probably like under a minute that I was reading to you over those slides, and it's powerful, right? So if we start to think about a kid who actually has a graphomotor weakness, to be able to persist through school, and even to be able to engage in the learning that person might be very interested in or desirable to or find it desirable to participate in, there's a certain amount of resilience that kids really benefit from developing, because they are frankly going to be frustrated often, even when they have their needs met through accommodations. The challenge itself is really enough to kind of keep someone in this frustrated place. So I was looking through some of my own materials, and I just want to show you how Robert Brooks talks about resilience. And if you're interested in his work, then I can give you some more resources and all that kind of stuff. But so if we think about it in terms of neuromotor function, and then we think about the way Robert Brooks defines resilience, and this is from one of his books, which, by the way, is excellent. He talks about it as the inner strength to deal effectively with stress and pressure, to cope with everyday challenges, to bounce back from disappointments, adversity, and trauma, to develop clear and realistic goals, to solve problems, to relate comfortably with others, and to treat oneself and others with respect. So if you think about the kids that you know that really struggle with motor function, and typically in our line of work as educators, that'll be kids that are struggling with graphomotor, oromotor, and fine motor. Although, as you guys very nicely connected, there's actually a lot of gross motor activities built in to the school day that are also invisible. It can be difficult to think of maintaining a sense of self-respect through that, that's a huge struggle, and to deal with the ongoing stress and pressure. So in Robert Brooks's work, he really features how to develop resilience, and he approaches that through this idea of mindsets. And he looks at classroom mindsets, both in terms of teachers' mindsets, what it takes to build a classroom that supports resilience in children, and in terms of students' mindsets, what are the features of the mindsets that we would like students to be able to develop so that they can persist through difficulty. So I just want to show you a couple of his kind of lists of descriptors of negative mindsets and positive mindsets and see if that strikes a chord in terms of students that you know in your experience, so that we can start to look at where might that person be in terms of their resilience in the face of difficulty. So we're going to talk about it for today, likely in terms of motor function, but I do not by any stretch of the imagination want to limit your thinking to this construct in terms of resilience. So like for someone who's struggling with memory, for someone who's struggling primarily with higher order function, for someone who is struggling with language, ordering systems, the need for resilience remains, although the face of their difficulty might look a little bit different day to day in the classroom. And of course, as we've been thinking about, and I saw in your posts, one construct can have severe implications for others. So if you can't take notes, because of graphomotor weakness, it will occur to those around you that you have a weak memory, weak language potentially, weak higher order thinking skills, things like that. Right? Okay. So I started with the features of negative mindsets because this was reminding me of the kinds of comments I was seeing on the discussion board after what you were reflecting on your experience of having difficulty. And so let's take a look at these, and then I'm going to ask you if any of these resonate in particular for yourself or kids that you've known that are struggling. So one is this idea of a sense of helplessness, a lack of control or influence about events that happen in one's life. And this is what always stood out to me as signs that kids were really struggling. Those kids that even when they do something well, they don't attribute their success to their own work, effort, skill, talent, knowledge. They attribute it to chance. I got it this time, but that's just unusual. It's fate. They don't feel in control. They feel helpless. There's a sense of hopelessness. This will never change. There's the idea that people don't understand me and they can't help. They're kind of locked in their world of their struggle. They feel unloved and unaccepted often, feeling that they don't make a difference in the world or don't belong, and then just a general feeling things aren't fair. So take a second, and if anyone would like to speak to it or write to it, can you see connections between difficulty in neuromotor function, output, especially in the classroom, and these kinds of attributes that seem to come up for kids? And for some, this may have come up already if you've selected a target student for the assignment for this course. I encourage you to think about that student through this lens and see what resonates or what doesn't about the kids. And I've read some of the ones that were submitted part 1 already, so I happen to know there's some stuff in there. So my question to you is, what connections and anyone can also just chime in too, by the way, orally if you prefer. It's kind of a big question. And then I have another question. Is that question too hard? I don't know if you guys are thinking, writing, or you don't like that question. So I'll share with you while you're thinking. And because I started with my son as our case study, good. I think it's common for students with neuromotor function challenges, this is Kate, to feel discouraged, and frustrated. That was the Fat City connection I was coming up with. Robin, you're saying you have a student who feels misunderstood and unaccepted due to language issues. Yeah. You'll even hear kids say that sometimes. I don't know if you have, Robin, but I've heard them say, you don't understand what it's like for me. My own son, that's what I was starting to say, is he was saying throughout the fall, he was starting to have a lot of these kinds of features of the negative mindsets. He would always say, I'll never get my way. And then even if he, won the game or it was his turn and he got the, special prize, he would say, no, I didn't win. He would kind of misinterpret situations as negative, even if they weren't. And I think it was connected to his unaddressed struggle. That he really took that on. He would often say, I'll never be able to get my way. I will never do this. My sister will always get to do things first and better than me. And he was really starting to wear that. He also would say things like, I don't know if I'd shared this with you last week, but he would say things to my husband and me like, we would say, oh, you're so great, and we know you're having trouble at school, but you're such a great guy, and we just love you. And he would say things like, oh, you don't know what I'm like at school. I'm not like this. I'm different there. It's not that way. And so he had really begun, through just a few months of struggle at the beginning of kindergarten, he had developed a mentality of seeing himself through these lenses. So it's kind of a red alert when you see these kinds of comments and aspects of the way a student views themselves and their mindset. To me, that's a red alert that there's something unaddressed for that child and that it needs to be addressed so that they don't develop a kind of very full-blown negative mindset. Right, Lori, so that's that, Lori, I believe. I have a student who constantly needs prompting to play with peers. He always says, I can't play like everyone else. They're going to laugh at me. I always lose. Exactly. Isn't that sad, right? When you hear it, it's heartbreaking to see that. Right, Kate. And so Lori's comment backs right up on that, right? So students might not be included in games or team sports due to their poor gross motor skills, which leads to feelings of exclusion. Exactly. Sometimes students don't know why there are things they can't do that their peers can do. Easily it causes them to feel dumb or like they're different in a negative way. That is exactly what my son was saying when he said, oh, Charlotte is my daughter's name. Oh, Charlotte reads first, I'll never read. Charlotte can do math, I'll never do math. Charlotte can run, I'll never run. And instead of looking at it from a positive mindset, I haven't done that yet, he's younger than her, he had already decided that was unavailable to him. And that's related to his struggles in the classroom. One student I have, this is Alexandra, with neuromotor challenges, the only student I have that uses bad words. I can't, Exactly. And so that, to me, all of those examples are exactly what I was asking about. All of those examples, to me, indicate potentially, or suggest, I wouldn't say indicate, because too far, but suggest that the student has adopted a more negative mindset than is going to really serve. And I consider that a red alert because, to me, addressing how a student is seeing themselves as a participant in the classroom is really crucial to resilience. So all of those examples also demonstrate a kid that starts, as Alexandra's saying, with I can't, is unlikely to be the one to persist through a very challenging task. If you enter the task with I can't, you have not as good a chance of persisting through difficulty as someone who enters it I can, right? I think that's fairly straightforward. For a student who can't understand why their peers are able to perform certain tasks and that person is not, as Linnell is sharing, resilience to persist through the practice necessary to develop the motor skills to participate is a lot more challenging than it is for a person who's actually noticing their peers can do something they can't, experiencing themselves as competent, and then attempting to learn what they need to learn. And that same idea, I can't play, they're going to laugh at me, that fear and isolation is sad to watch, and also a potential indicator that that child has needs that need to be addressed such that they can participate meaningfully. So to me, these I'll post these slides if that's helpful for people as like another resource up there in our page, because I go back to these features as I'm listening into kids to kind of check in, like where are they at with the idea of resilience. And especially for kids with struggle, they need to have resilience to be able to persist through the difficulties that are likely going to follow them through schooling. The demands of school, we can differentiate for them. We can universally design lessons. We can provide access, but it's very difficult to guarantee that that's going to be their experience in school over the years. And so as a classroom teacher, I always felt personally interested in supporting kids to also develop enough independence in their learning, which includes a sense of higher self-esteem and resilience than negative mindsets indicate. I always wanted to give that to kids to take forward when they left me, that they can have a sense of strength for themselves moving forward. So I will post those for you as the kind of indicators. This next slide gives you features of a resilient mindset, which are kind of the flip side of the coin, right? And I will post these as well. And these are the kinds of ways of looking at the world and at yourself that really allow a person to take on the intense practice and work and challenge that it can take to participate in school in the face of a struggle in one of these constructs that's severe enough to really limit their ability to work independently on academic tasks. And some of these I also found are fun for like kind of classroom climate features and mini lessons, like the third bullet point being empathic. There's a lot of ways to practice that in the classroom, and it serves all. Problem solving skills serves all. Displaying effective communication, we can practice that in an explicit way. It serves all. So I find that these explicit attention to these features of resilient mindsets through academic work is also a contribution to students that are really struggling, but also students that are not really struggling in an obvious way. Okay, and then I'll put this here too. This is from this book, The Power of Resilience, which again, excellent book. You're not assigned it, but it's a really great book. These were developed more for adults, or that book is oriented more towards adults. And they map on to the features of a positive mindset. So like viewing life through the eyes of others maps on to the idea of being empathic, right? So Robert Brooks's work is around this kind of less academic work, but it really addresses what happens to kids emotionally and socially and in terms of participation when they are struggling. And so I like to use the neurodevelopmental framework and the mindsets work together, because it really opens up this idea of understanding the nature of a student's struggle and also their strengths and interests through a neurodevelopmental lens, and then understanding the connection between their neurodevelopmental profile of strengths and weaknesses and their mindset in the classroom. And I find that with some kind of balanced attention to those two ways of thinking about kids, I was much more able as a teacher to identify the particular strategies and supports that individuals needed, and it made life a ton more empowering. Does anyone have questions about that? I know I just dumped a lot on you. Okay, if you do, just write them in at some point. Wow, okay, and once again, time has run away from us. So we have 4 minutes. So the other thing I want to tell you is that this work with mindsets, I also think, is a nice connector construct between neuromotor function and social cognition, which is what you will start looking at information about for next week. So we'll transition there, and I think that neuromotor function, I've already seen people start to hint at the ways that neuromotor function impacts a student's social participation. Those two constructs are very closely connected, actually. So when we think about kids not getting put for teams, kids not being able to play with other kids, there are social ramifications of neuromotor challenge, and this is where gross motor function also starts to come in ways that aren't always occurring within the classroom, but impact how a student views themselves. That makes its way then into academic work. So for the kid that's awkward in space or has gross motor weakness, to the extent that that kid is then kind of alienated or ostracized from same-age peers and develops a negative sense of self, that negative sense of self typically remains in the classroom, in classroom tasks, and starts to have this kind of broader impact. Then we have trouble in group work and in partner work. Someone's post, gosh, I sincerely apologize for not remembering whose it was. Someone's post, I think it was at Fenton, was saying that you have a student in kindergarten who has an oromotor challenge, and that student becomes highly frustrated in think, pair, share, and kind of physically yells at and or attacks their partner for not listening, but actually that person's speech is challenged, and so their partners aren't necessarily able to. That is a great example of a social ramification of a motor weakness. And so if that goes unaddressed, if the motor weakness goes unaddressed for that student, it's entirely plausible that impacting social cognition over time will be a real thing to contend with. And so I just really encourage you all, as you go through this week, to not just look at the connections between graphomotor and neuromotor function in general across all of the constructs, but also hone in a bit on social cognition, like, once you look at that stuff, which I know isn't going to happen until probably like Monday. But once you do, or if you watch Craig Pullman's video on the connections between the functions, between the constructs, it might give you some insight into how those two constructs are related in really unique ways that are not directly addressed typically in academic tasks, but impact participation in academic tasks, and therefore are interesting to me, and a bit of those kind of like mysterious features of what is happening with kids in classrooms. So that's all I really wanted to tell you for tonight. Does anyone have anything you wanted to ask or say before I sign off? And if not, it's totally fine. I saw a few people have been turning in the part 1 of the assignment. Looks good. Thank you. If you haven't, have fun with it a little bit, or use it for your good, which I think you know anyway. But I just really encourage you to be a little bit playful with the ideas in this course, so that you can just kind of help develop and hone your lens of observing kids closely and supporting them in ways that they need. And with that, I think we're good here. It's 7, so I never like to hold people afterwards. I was that kid who wanted to go at the very end of whenever the bell rang. I was out, so I will now impose that on you. If you need anything, email me directly, please. I'm more than happy to work with all of you individually to the extent that that is interesting to you. And have a good week. I will see you next Thursday, also 6 to 7. Okay? Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. I don't know how to...
Goodbye.